Okay, picture this. You have one of the busiest, most dangerous migration routes on the entire planet, right? 100 miles of pure, roadless jungle. And then, almost overnight, it just goes quiet. That's exactly what we saw happen in the Darien Gap. So the big question is, how does a path that was used by 500,000 people just vanish?
And when I say it went quiet, I mean the speed and the sheer scale of this shutdown, it's just stunning. Let's dive right into the numbers.
Yeah, 98%. Just let that sink in for a second. That's the estimated drop in people crossing the Darien Gap by 2025. I mean, that's a number that's almost hard to wrap your head around.
I mean, just think about that contrast for a moment. You've got over 500,000 people making this incredibly dangerous trek in just 1 year. And now, it's come to a near total standstill. What was essentially a human highway has turned back into a silent, empty jungle trail.
So this is the real puzzle we're going to unpack here. How did this happen? And to really get it, we've got to hit rewind. We need to look at how this incredibly treacherous piece of jungle became a global migration corridor to begin with.
All right, so let's talk about the dramatic rise of the Darien Gap. How on earth did this remote jungle become such a major crossroads for people seeking hope, but also facing unbelievable danger?
And we really need to be clear about what we're talking about here. The Darien Gap isn't just, a missing piece of highway. We're talking about one of the most hazardous environments on the planet. There are no roads, no services, just brutal terrain, wild animals, and a very real, very constant criminal threat. And the growth in people using this route, it was just explosive. You see it right here. It went from just a trickle in the early 2010s to an absolute flood by 2023. It's really the story of multiple global crises, all funneling through this one incredibly narrow, incredibly dangerous corridor.
And we have to remember who was making this journey. We're not just talking about individuals here. We're talking about entire families, people with young children. They came from all over, Latin America, the Caribbean, even as far as Africa and Asia. They were fleeing truly desperate situations, violence, collapsing economies, repression, and they were willing to risk everything in that jungle for even the slightest chance at a safer life.
Okay, so what flipped the switch? What caused this massive, drastic change? Well, it really all starts with a single, incredibly powerful campaign promise. There it is. We are going to close the Darien. That's from Panama's newly elected president at the time, José Raúl Mulino. And that wasn't just a soundbite, it became the policy. See, migration had turned into a massive political issue in Panama, and he got elected with a very, very clear mandate to do something about it.
And this wasn't just talk. Panama rolled out a really coordinated, multi-pronged strategy. They didn't just put up a sign. No, they deployed security forces right to the border. They actively shut down the informal trails and the makeshift camps. And this is the really critical part. They set up systems to redirect and repatriate migrants, sending them back to Colombia or even their home countries, often with help from partners like the U.S.
So you see, this whole thing wasn't happening in a vacuum, right? It was kind of a perfect storm. You had this intense political pressure inside Panama. Then you had some crucial influence from the United States, which started supporting deportation flights and tightening its own asylum rules. That basically reduced the incentive for people to even start the journey. And on top of all that, you just had the simple fact that Panama's own resources were completely and totally overwhelmed. But here's the thing. While the policy might look like a success on paper, it's created a whole new set of really complex and honestly pretty grim realities on the ground. I mean, look, from Panama's official perspective, the plan absolutely worked. That massive flow of people moving north, it got choked off. But stopping the flow is definitely not the whole story. Because that quiet in the jungle, it hides a pretty harsh truth. Humanitarian groups on the ground are reporting that migrants are now just stranded, with way fewer aid workers there to help them. The problem hasn't been solved at all. It's just been moved. And the big fear now is that people are going to start looking for new, maybe even more dangerous routes to get through.
And there was another, maybe unexpected consequence, an economic one. You see, some of the indigenous communities right there along the route had built up these small informal economies around the migration, helping with transport, providing food or a place to stay. What with the route closed, that income just vanished almost overnight. And that's really destabilized some of those local villages.
Okay, so let's pull the camera back a bit and look at the big picture here. What does a closure like this actually mean when we talk about global migration?
And this is probably the most important idea to grasp. You can't literally build a wall across 100 miles of dense, unforgiving jungle. It's just not possible. So the closure of the Darien Gap, it wasn't about bricks and mortar. It was about policy. It was about political will, active enforcement, and a strategy to make the route so difficult and so risky that it was no longer a viable option.
When you boil it all down, the story of the Darien Gap really teaches us a few powerful lessons. First, it shows just how quickly domestic politics in one country can completely redraw the map for global migration. It also shows how vulnerable these natural choke points are to focused policy enforcement. But maybe the biggest takeaway is this: shutting down a route does absolutely nothing to solve the root causes, the desperation and danger that force people to flee their homes in the first place.
And that leaves us with a really critical question, doesn't it? Because closing a route doesn't stop migration. It just changes the map. The flow of people searching for safety and a better life, that's not going to stop. So if the Darien Gap isn't the path anymore, you have to wonder, where does the path lead now? And will it be even more dangerous than the one that just vanished?